Say first, good morning, shalom aleichem, peace to you all, and to Reverend De La Cruz, Yasher Koach, which we say after someone's preached words of power, words of truth. It means loosely more power to you. So, since this is an interfaith panel, I'd like to start with a bracha, a blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Holy One of Being, who calls us to learn from and discuss holy scriptures, words of faith and truth. And I think it's in the discussion that the real learning takes place. So I hope we'll have a lot of time for the panelists to talk among each other, but even more importantly, among you. Because as Martin Buber said, it's all about the dialogue, it's all about the exchange. I first would like to recognize and honor my own teachers, because I think that's an important part of why I'm here. They would be Rabbis Lynn Gottlieb, Rabbi Arthur Waskow, and most particularly Rabbi Everett Gendler, who, if you could say anyone is an expert in Jewish nonviolence, it would be Rabbi Gendler. Unfortunately, he slowed down just a little bit because he turns 90 next month. But he is a veteran of the civil rights movement and has done more exploration of Jewish theology of nonviolence probably than anyone. The other person I have to mention as a role model, though I never was privileged to meet him, is Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was one of the greatest Jewish theologians, or theologians in general, of the 20th century, a friend, a colleague, and comrade of Dr. King's, a civil rights activist who famously said on the Selma March that he felt as though his legs were praying. But more than anyone, and this is the interfaith pollination, cross-pollination, Chloe opened by recognizing that Monday was the second anniversary of Father Daniel Berrigan's passing. And more than anyone, he's responsible for my sitting here, for being a rabbi, for being the person I am, the moral example that he embodied in his whole life, his pursuit of nonviolence, for peace, for justice, the sacrifices that he underwent, prison, sometimes to his own life. If he had not been the priest that he was, I certainly would not be a rabbi or the rabbi that I am. And I want to say, Zichrono Livracha, may his memory be for a blessing, and even more, may it be an inspiration to all those who carry on his work for a just and peaceful society. So I want to do two things very quickly. One, talk a little about my own path that brought me, again, to this spot, my own path to nonviolence, because it is unique. I don't think it, in any way, it represents the Jewish community, which is itself tremendously diverse. And then speak specifically about a few sources from the Jewish tradition, from the Bible and rabbinic tradition, that point in the direction of an ethic of nonviolence. So my own involvement it's really now over 40 years of involvement in various nonviolent social movements for racial justice, for immigrant rights, for human rights, for peace, really began in high school, back to Rajni, with reading Gandhi and being fascinated with satyagraha, the power of soul force, mass nonviolence, civil disobedience, which played such a critical role in freeing India from colonial British power, colonial British rule. That really was the germ, for me, that set me on this path. In university, in the mid-70s, I was involved with the early days of the anti-apartheid movement, which then expanded to be a more broad anti-racist movement on campus. But as part of that were a number of nonviolent direct actions, including the occupation of the administration building that I took part in, and others that really, again, awakened my consciousness of what the power of nonviolence and nonviolent direct action. My first job after college was working at the Martin Luther King Center for Nonviolent Social Change in Atlanta. It was the first time I'd lived in the South. I met there and studied with many of the civil rights leaders that I'd read about growing up, including some of the key architects of the original Poor People's Campaign. And I was provided by the center with housing, and my next door neighbor was Coretta Scott King, who invited me over for tea a few times, and I was able to hear stories, the background of the civil rights movement that you don't get from the history books. So all these things informed me. My next life work experience was living and working for 5 years in a community that was dedicated to doing trainings in nonviolence theory and practice called the Movement for a New Society. We tried to, what we say, live the nonviolent revolution, both in collective households and in doing trainings. And people came from all over the world to do these trainings, from India, from Brazil, from Britain. So it was an incredible international experience of nonviolence. And then finally, while I was in rabbinical school, I was sort of at the golden age, I would say, of my rabbinical school, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, when there was a young president, Ira Silverstein, who's sadly passed away since then, who had a model of creating organizer rabbis who would be rabbis out in the world, not just working in the Jewish community. And during the entire time that I was in rabbinical school, I was not only tolerated, but encouraged to continue activism. And it was particularly then in the context of US wars in Central America, so I was active in the first sanctuary movement and forming a group that helped synagogues become sanctuaries, and also in the then burgeoning anti-nuclear movement. And that's where, again, I met Father Berrigan after they committed the famous Plowshares 8 action. I was part of the community support team, and then later took part in different actions at that same General Electric plant with him. I participated over the years in acts of direct action, nonviolent direct action at places like the White House, the Pentagon, CIA headquarters, the South African Embassy, US consulate to the UN, many military bases. But I would just mention one that was one of the most powerful. The context for most of it, I have to say, was interfaith, and usually, more often than not, Catholic, among radical Catholic pacifists. And in one, we discovered that a military base, the Willow Grove Air Base, not far from Philadelphia, was one of the major shipment points of weapons to Central America when the US was supporting the Contras and the counter-revolutionary movements there. So this group of non-violent Catholics called the Brandywine Peace Community, and me, the tag-along Jew, we did an action there that, to me, it really was transformative and really sort of felt like taking oneself to a different level of law. There's human law and then there's God's law. And this was one of my most powerful experiences of making that move. We took carpets and we climbed over the gates of the base. It was an airfield. And we, with the carpets, put them over the barbed wire and climbed down and went onto the runway. And the Catholic activists poured on the runway blood that they had taken from themselves, symbolically from Catholic tradition, and to show the bloodshed of the people of Central America that this base in US policy was responsible for. And we stood in prayer and reflection until the MPs came and removed us. But that moment, in some ways, was really one of the most transformative. So again, my nonviolence was formed in this crucible of multi-faith action, and I've worked in many specifically Jewish social justice organizations, New Jewish Agenda, Rabbis for Human Rights, in London, the Jewish Socialist Group, and I'm on the rabbinic board of Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. But I think it's been this multi-faith involvement that's been so important to me. Okay, because now I get to the Jewish part. It's certainly not the case that Judaism is a pacifist religion in the way that Quakers or Jains are. And if you read the Hebrew Bible, in all honesty, there's no shortage, just similar to the Vedas or the Ramayana, of war, of murder, of bloodshed, but also embedded in the same scripture are principles that over 2,000 years of rabbinic tradition could be teased out to form what I could perhaps call a coherent Jewish ethic of nonviolence. And I'll mention just a few of them, and we can talk about them more in the discussion period. I should say also, Judaism certainly does recognize the moral right, the moral validity of self-defense, both individual and communal, be that nonviolent or not. So Judaism as a form of ethical monotheism rests on the idea of covenant, a mutually binding pact between God and the Jewish people, but also between God and all of humanity. It's an idea that human beings are created with a responsibility to God. And probably the most important for me, the foundational idea of that is stated in Genesis, that human beings are created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God. Now in Judaism, we don't believe God has an image or a form. So what does that mean? That's a way of saying that human life is of ultimate worth and value. Every human life, not just Jewish, not just all human life. And that's stated in different ways, both positive and negative in Jewish tradition. The positive is that every life should be preserved. Every life should be protected. And there's a principle, pikuach nefesh, literally saving or rescuing a soul, but it means saving a life, which really is such a strong principle that it almost overrides all other commandments, all other ritual commandments, all other biblical and rabbinic commandments, that to save a life. In other words, I can violate the Sabbath if I'm going to save someone's life. The only thing I can't do to save a life, especially if it's my own, is commit murder. I can do other things, but I can't commit murder. So this is a positive way of saying human life is of ultimate sanctity. In the Mishnah, the Jewish law code, it stated, whosoever saves a life, it is considered as if that person saved an entire world. And whosoever destroys a life, it is considered as if that person destroyed an entire world. So again, reinforcing the ultimate sanctity of human life. Now, the other side of that is the prohibition on murder, lo tirtzach, which is enshrined not only in the Ten Commandments, I think that's where most people know it from, but also in what are called the 7 Noahide commandments, which were the laws that God gave to Noah for all humanity. So that prohibition on murder is binding not just on the Jewish people, but on all humanity, that you cannot take another human being's life without cause or in anything other than ultimate self-defense. A few other ways that underwrite this Jewish conception of the value of human lives come from the Passover story, which we celebrated last month. One is the example of the Hebrew midwives who were ordered by Pharaoh to kill the male infants, but refused to do so in what might be one of the first recorded instances of nonviolent civil disobedience. There's also a midrash, that's a sort of rabbinic reading between the lines tale, that says that after crossing the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army was drowning, being destroyed, the angels were singing God's praises for this act. And God rebukes the angels and says, how can you sing and rejoice when my children are drowning in the sea? Now think of that. The Pharaoh, who in Jewish tradition represents the ultimate and oppressive power, and his army, his military, which was used to oppress and enslave the Israelites, God is saying, they too are my children. You have to respect their humanity. They may be your opponents, your enemy in a sense, but their essential humanity is there too. Also, in the course of the Passover Seder, we drink cups of wine, which in Judaism is symbolic of joy. And when we do the recitation of the 10 plagues that befell the Egyptians, we take out a drop of wine as we recite each plague, symbolically reducing our own joy because the Egyptians had to suffer in that we could experience our own liberation from slavery. So that's all just to underline the sanctity of human life in the biblical tradition and then the rabbinic development of it. I'm going to just quickly mention a few other principles, biblical and then developed through rabbinic tradition. One is the principle of Bal Tashchit, which means do not destroy. It comes from a biblical command that is set in the context of warfare that forbids the cutting down of fruit trees to assist in a siege, but is later expanded to be any kind of unnecessary destruction or violence. And in recent times, it's become the basis of a Jewish environmental ethic that we shouldn't destroy the global ecosystem because that sustains us and it sustains all of us. There's the principle of Tsa'ar Ba'alei Chayim, the prohibition of causing suffering of living creatures, any living creatures, domestic or wild. It comes from a biblical verse about not taking a mother bird from the nest with the eggs. And it's trying, in my thought of this, to induce an empathy, a feeling that all beings are worthy of compassion and that all beings, that their lives also are to be valued. It's also the basis for shechita, which is the Jewish form of slaughter, that it's supposed to be the most compassionate or merciful form of slaughter. And I've got 2 minutes. Then there's the idea of Lashon Hara, that violence can not only be in the form of action, but in the form of words. And we certainly know that, putting on the TV news these days, that you can do as much damage through what you say as through lifting your fist. And that the rabbis likened shaming someone or speaking ill of them to taking their blood, because they become red in the face, so it's almost as though you've drawn their blood. I'll say a few more things. The whole of the prophetic tradition, Isaiah, Amos, Micah, Jeremiah, speaks to what Reverend De La Cruz was speaking to, which is the denunciation of structural violence, the violence of exploitation by the kings, by the ruling elite. And it's amazing that the compilers of the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible, included this, because it's like it's a built-in self-critique of the abuses of Jewish power by the ruling elite from within the Israelite society itself. Finally, on the active side is the command, tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, justice, justice, you shall pursue. Why is justice repeated? For the rabbis, there was never any unnecessary repetition of words. So one commentary is you have to pursue justice in your immediate circle, your family, your own faith community. But you can't stop there. You have to pursue it out into the wider world. And then lastly, I'll end with a concept that's taken from Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, called Tikkun Olam. It meant something very different in a mystical sense, but now it's taken to mean acts of justice, of compassion, of solidarity that help repair the world. So acts of social justice for immigrant rights, for human rights, racial justice, all of them are forms of ways of repairing the world. And I'll just end with a quote that's said during the Torah service every Shabbat, because I think this really sums up, for me, Jewish nonviolence. And speaking of the Torah, it is a tree of life for those who cling to it, and those who uphold it are happy. Its ways are ways of pleasantness, and all its paths are peace. And may we all walk those paths of peace.